Overcoming Extreme Self Expectations. My name is Amy Ballantyne. Welcome to Power to the People Pleasers. I'm so excited to have my guest Rachel here. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here.
You know, we have a lot of things in common being executive coaches and people who facilitate things. I'm super excited for people to hear your take on this idea of high sensory perception. We're going to get into that today. But before we do, I always ask, have you ever been a people pleaser? And if yes, how did that show up in your life?
Well, knowing that this question was coming up, I have obviously been thinking a lot about it. And the answer that I came up with, honestly, was no, I've never really been a people pleaser. That said, as a classic overthinker, I came up with all kinds of examples of times when I did do something that was either I didn't stand up for myself when I wanted to, or I said yes to something that was not normally within my boundaries, or something else that looking back could have looked like people pleasing. And yet the person that I was trying to please was me. It wasn't the other person. But it all came down to societal norms and personal expectations and what I expected of myself. And it's funny because some of these, I was going through these examples in my mind, and there was one. So I had a neighbor a couple of years ago who it was an older woman who was living with her adult son. Both of them needed help in social services kinds of ways. And something happened one night where the mother, who was struggling with dementia, had driven off somewhere and gotten lost and was stuck and didn't know where she was. And the son came upstairs. I really didn't know them. We didn't have much interaction. And the son came upstairs, and it was late at night. And he said, he was frantic. And he said, my mom is stuck and she's in this other town and she's got the truck and I have no way to get to her. Can you please drive me there? And my first thought was, oh my God, it's like the middle of the night and this is the last thing I want to do. And I ended up driving him there and taking him to pick up his mom. And then he drove them home. And it really was the last thing I wanted to do. And when I was talking to some friends afterwards, they said, God, I would never have done that. I just would have said no. And to me, I was like, but that's just being a decent human being. Like, I couldn't just leave them stranded. Like, what would you do? So I've got other examples like that. And it's really interesting because I think I think there's a lot to sort of dig into around what we expect of ourselves and who we're pleasing when we say yes, when we don't want to say yes, and things like that.
Yeah, when I first met you, I loved your take on this, that you weren't pleasing others, that you were pleasing yourself. And this extreme self-expectation is very normal. Isn't that why we hear the word should like every other sentence from
It,
many, many people?
it is. And the funny thing is, I always get on my clients' cases when I hear should from them. I always say, okay, I just want to stop you. You're
Same.
shoulding again.
Yes.
And yet we still do it to ourselves.
Yeah.
It is hard. It's really hard to get over shoulding.
Yeah. I'm so curious. For those of us who have been people pleasers, I'm a recovering people pleaser. How would you say you got to this place of not being a people pleaser? Like, how was your life different?
So it's a really interesting question. I was thinking about that too. I think I had to be pretty independent from a very early age. My family moved many, many times. I think I had lived in 5 states before the age of 8. So, and my parents got divorced when I was 5. I really learned early on, I kind of had to do my own thing to do what I wanted to be able to do. I didn't have, my mom was, my mom did an amazing job. She did the best she could. She was an attorney in days that there weren't a lot of women attorneys. And my brother and I were kind of on our own. And I think I just had to start doing things my own way. Um, I also learned, I definitely was bullied in school. I remember very clearly when we moved to New York City from Ohio, and I was not even 8 years old. And I remember a music class where kids were making fun of my accent because I pick up accents really quickly. And, I was 7 or whatever. I was still talking like an Ohioan, I guess.
Yeah.
And it just kind of reinforced for me, I have to be my own person. I need to do what I need to do for me. And that was just it.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, you had mentioned living in many places, and we all have such diverse stories that make us who we are and cause the person we become. It's so interesting to me. And I want people to understand how awesome you are. So I'm just going to share your bio. So they know, like, I'm super pumped for this conversation with you. It's already
Me
been
too.
lovely. So Rachel is a certified leadership and executive coach, mastermind facilitator, and author of Perspective, the power and potential of high sensory perception, which is coming in 2025. I think, right? You can clarify in a moment. With 25 years of leadership experience in tech startups and Fortune 500, she's passionate about helping other high sensory women leaders learn to thrive professionally and personally. So I'm super excited for us to dig into this, especially knowing that you are someone who has high sensory perception, supports individuals like this. I believe I have this as well, but I haven't really dug into it. As an area to understand and grow for myself. So I'm keen to learn from you. And I'd love to first start with when we have really or high to extremely high self expectations, is there a link to being a high sensory person? Or tell me about your thoughts on that.
So my sense is that most of the time, yes, there probably is. One of the things that I've learned about people who are high sensory, who are highly perceptive, is that we tend to be extremely conscientious. We tend to feel responsible for everything and everyone, and also to have very, very high expectations and high standards of excellence. And I think that at least part of that comes from the fact that our brains are wired a little bit differently. And there are, I'm not a numbers person. The numbers are something like 10 million or 11 million that our brains, everybody's brains, that everybody on the planet's brains, um, take in a certain crazy amount of input every day. Most brains filter out the majority of that, and it goes down from, I don't know, 10 or 11 million. I could be getting that number very, very wrong,
Okay.
to like 10 or 11 at a time that we are processing. And that, when I say inputs, it can be all kinds of stimuli. It can be sounds and lighting and temperature and people and energy and presence and lots of different things. The brains of highly perceptive people don't have the same filters. And so many, many, many more of those inputs of those stimuli are coming in. And because we are constantly taking in and processing all of these things, we notice the details. And we also make connections between things. And because of those two aspects of the trait, I think they naturally lead toward having higher expectations, perfectionism. We're constantly looking at all of the pieces. We have a gift that not a lot of people have, to be able to both look at the big picture and the details at the same time. And we can focus on both of them, maybe not at exactly the same time, but we do see all of the details and how they fit together. And we want to make sure those details are right, are high quality, are whatever it is that we're working on.
Very interesting. I am definitely that then.
Not
I'm like,
surprising.
uh-huh, yep, okay. Yeah. So, I'm curious about your book, Perspective, the power of power and potential of high sensory perception. What was the catalyst for you writing this book?
So one note, it's actually perceptive
Oh, thank you.
rather
Sorry.
than perspective, but they're
Mhm.
definitely related. They tie together.
Close. I was close. Poor note taking. Poor note taking. We'll call it that.
That's okay. No, it's good. It's interesting because there's gonna be a lot of perspective in the book too, so it fits. Um, so I have been focused in this let me go back a step. So I learned that I was highly perceptive, probably, or at least as the category goes, let's say,
Mhm.
um, about 20 years ago. There is a book called Highly Sensitive Person that was written by a psychologist, Elaine Aron, in I think 1997. And I read that book a few years after it came out. Um, I immediately identified with everything in that book, and it really put so many things in my life into perspective. It put
Mm.
patterns that I had had around jobs and around relationships and things. It made them make sense.
Mhm.
And I had always known that I was highly sensitive. I mean, I knew that as a child, but I didn't know that I wasn't alone in it. I thought
Mhm.
that, my brain worked differently and there weren't other people who had the same kind of challenges or thought the same way about it. So the book was a revelation because it talked about, I think Aaron said that there were 15 to 20% of the population had this trait. I promptly forgot about it, and 20 years went by. And then a series of events happened a little while ago, a little more than a year ago, that made me revisit the book, that reminded me of the book,
Yeah.
made me read it again, and suddenly just like everything fell into place. Lots of little clicks happened. And I realized that all of the leadership clients I had been working with, I think 99% of them actually also fell into this category. And so I've been, reading and researching and talking with leaders who identify as highly sensitive since then.
Mhm.
But I very quickly realized that there is a huge challenge around this. And that is that the word sensitive and sensitivity um, have been highly and wrongly stigmatized in
Yes.
our culture. And so first of all, there are a lot of people that just don't know about this trait.
Mhm.
Second, there are a lot of people who have it, but may not want to raise their hand and say, oh, yeah, that's me. Because, especially if you're in corporate, if you're in tech, which is where I was for, almost 30 years, um, it can be seen as a weakness to
Mhm.
be sensitive. And I'm interviewing a lot of people for the book now, and I'm hearing very similar stories about the trauma that people have been through, either in their childhoods or actually as adults, um, when they respond differently or are emotional about something that other people aren't emotional about, or something comes up that shows their sensitivity and their mask is removed.
Mhm.
So I had been struggling with the language around it and trying to figure out how to reach people who don't necessarily want to be reached that way. There is a coach in the UK who was using the term high sensory intelligence, which I think is brilliant for a lot of reasons.
Mhm.
He's also trademarked it.
Mhm.
Um, but there are things about that also turn people off, right? I,
Mhm.
I strongly believe in Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences, and I believe there are a lot more than Gardner actually identified. Um, but also on hearing it, some people see an elitism, like, oh, you're intelligent and I'm not, which is not at all the way that it's meant, but it can
Yeah,
trigger some things in people.
for sure.
So someone actually reached out to me based on the things they saw on my profile and some of the stuff that I had written and asked me if I was interested in writing a book. And we got on the phone and we actually had a couple of conversations and talked for well over an hour. And the term perceptive came up. And I'm going to give him the credit. It wasn't me who came up with it. It was absolutely brilliant because I started looking up all of the different dictionary definitions of the word perceptive and what perceptiveness means. And it clicked for me right away.
Mm-hmm.
Um, then it clicked for everyone around me that I started, bringing it up with. And
Absolutely.
it's what we're doing. We are perceiving
Mhm.
all kinds of information. Sometimes it's, visually, sometimes it's energetically or emotionally, sometimes it's auditorily, but we are perceiving on a whole different level than most people perceive. And being perceptive is, as far as I can tell, universally thought of as a positive thing. There's no stigma associated with it. So
Yeah.
I've had a really, really positive response around
Yeah.
the name.
I'm so glad. Well, and around the concepts that I'm sure you're going to share in the book, I'm excited for it to come out and for getting a copy myself. I'll be sure to put all the links and everything to connect with you in the show notes so people can follow along and stay tuned for that announcement. I'm sure they'll be excited as well. I want to jump over a little bit back into this idea of extreme self expectation and being a coach of many leaders in tech and otherwise, and with this mastermind that you have where you focus on grace, resilience, intuition, trust, these core concepts. What would you say are the important messages you want to deliver to those individuals who constantly have these extreme self expectations?
Yeah. So I mean, there are so many things that I could say that are trite sounding, right? Like perfection is the enemy of the good. We've all heard that, and it really doesn't honestly make a difference in the way that we are. We're still seeing what we're seeing and feeling what we're feeling.
Mhm.
I think the most important thing is I ask all my clients, who do you want to be? How do you want to show up in the world? And what are the traits that person, that version of you focuses on and manifests? And
Mhm.
how does that look in terms of what you're accomplishing and what your relationships look like? And what's getting in the way of that now? And often this these extreme expectations and this high achievement
Mhm.
piece of the trait is one of the things that's getting in the way. It's very hard to take a first step if you have this vision that pops in almost complete and perfect and you see every detail of it, and you're afraid that you might not be able to achieve that whole
Yep.
vision, right?
Yeah.
One of the things that I talk about a lot with clients is breaking things down.
Mhm.
So try to step back from the big picture a little bit. Try to just break things down into chunks. What is the very first thing I need to do? And if that thing feels big, how can I break that thing down
Mhm.
into little baby steps? Um, Nothing is carved in stone. Nothing is forever. So take one baby step. How can you do that in a way
Mhm.
that will satisfy you and get you one step closer to your goal?
Mhm.
And if something needs to change at that point, great, change it. There's nothing wrong with that. Embracing the possibility of failure as a learning opportunity, as an education, rather than, oh my God, I did something wrong. Somebody's going to look at me badly, because I did that.
Yeah.
Um, Realizing that we're actually looking at, well, everything in a more detailed way than most people around us are. So we're noticing more flaws. We're expecting more. Most people don't have the expectations that we have. That's
Mhm.
that's what this is about, right?
Yeah.
So how can we make it easier on ourselves by lowering our expectations? Start with little things. Maybe you have a to-do list of like 18 things that you're going to get done for the day. Can you be happy if you get 5 of them done for the day?
Mhm.
Most people have a to-do list with like 3 things on it, right?
Yeah.
So all of the ways that we can achieve successes and start moving towards our goals and do it a way that in a way that we're comfortable with, that doesn't necessarily have to be the perfect grand vision. It's
Yeah.
hard. It's hard because
It is hard. And I think that's I agree. Yes, all of the things. Yes. And yes, and I I think that recognizing it is going to be hard. And if you're someone who's putting your hand up going, yeah, I do set extreme self expectations, one of the first questions would be, okay, and how is this a problem for you? Like, is it a problem, and do you want to change? Because sometimes people don't want to change. You have to have the desire and willingness
right.
behind it, right, to then
Absolutely.
exactly follow the steps you're putting in place for them, right, of breaking it down. I love that. And the other
Absolutely.
thing I think is interesting to consider with this is for people to recognize, okay, are or is having this extreme self expectation serving them?
Mhm. Right.
Like, how is
Absolutely.
that helping? Is it because some people would say, oh, it helps me to achieve and get all these things done? And okay, so then again, we go back to, okay, well, then how is this a problem? Is this a problem or not?
Right. I totally agree, Amy, and that's a great point. I mean, if it is serving you, more power to you. I mean, there
Yeah.
are so many amazing superpowers about having this trait, this high sensory perception, and the things that come with it, like
Yeah.
the extreme,
Expectations. Yeah.
expectations. Um, that said, I know in my life where it's held me back, and I know in my clients' lives where it's
My
held
hand is up.
right. So, and it can be contextual too. Maybe it could be helpful to isolate it to certain parts of your life that
Mhm.
really do need that kind of attention and that kind of high expectation. So, I spent many, many years as a professional editor. You
Wow.
want to have those kinds of expectations
Yes.
when you're doing editorial work, right? I mean, that's
Yeah.
part of you are helping to raise others' work to perfectionist standards, right?
Yeah.
At the same time, I'm also a writer, and this is coming up in writing the book now. I
Yeah.
can't write the way I edit because I'll never get
You'll
anything
never
on
get
the
there.
page.
Every sentence,
So
overthinking it 100 times, right?
exactly, and
Yeah.
I can't even write a chapter without like literally editing myself as I go along. Is that serving me? Not in any way.
For sure.
So
For sure.
keep it to the pieces, the parts of your life and the parts of your work where it is an asset. If you work in engineering, if you work in creative, fields, whatever you're doing, I'm sure there's a portion of it where there's a place for that. And you can
Yes.
channel that energy into that part. But then maybe give yourself some grace and
Mm.
let it go in a couple of other places and see how that feels.
Yeah.
And see if you feel, I don't know, liberated or
Yeah.
less stressed.
I love that. Recognize the place that it serves
Yeah.
and be open to the possibility of letting some of it go in the places that it's not. I love that. Awesome. Awesome. I think we could talk all day, Rachel. Let's be real.
I think
We
we
could
could.
talk all day. So, you have a free sense and sensitivity assessment. I will put the link below for people to check that out. Can you tell us a little bit more
Perfect.
about that assessment so people go click it?
Sure. So there are a lot of people have asked me for an assessment to find out whether or not they are highly perceptive. And you know what? I can direct people towards those. There are many of them that are out there. This one is particularly looking at, especially for professionals, for leaders in the corporate world,
Mhm.
um, looking at the various aspects of your life, particularly your work life, but there are a few things in there that are personally focused as well. And assessing kind of what needs attention.
Mm.
And I think people pleasers will find this particularly interesting because um, I used to use, I host these executive roundtables for women leaders. And sometimes I'll do little sections of the self-assessment with them. And there's the last section is about it's about boundaries, and it's about what do you do in your life that's just for you, and what do you do that brings you joy. And I've actually had people come to tears when we've talked about some of these questions. So I hope it's helpful for your listeners.
Oh, I look forward to that for them. So thank you for making that available. And is there anything you'd like to wrap up with as we close today?
Just I think two things. One of them is the question, who do you want to be? As I said before, how do you want to show up in the world? And not just for other people. How do you want to show up for yourself in the world? And the other thing is, think about leaders you admire. I know that in today's world, it can be sometimes hard to identify them, but if you can think of any from your past or from now, what is it about them that you admire, and how do they stand up? What do they stand up for? How do they stand up for themselves? How do they decide what they're going to commit to and what they're not, and how they're going to spend their time? And, if it's harder to do it for yourself and say, how do you want to show up? Think about what you admire and respect about those people and the boundaries that they set, and again, how they commit to things. That was a little garbled. I hope it made sense.
No, absolutely made sense. Look to other people. Yeah. And answer those great questions. I love it. I love it. I'm so grateful for your time today, for your beautiful energy, and for this awesome conversation. Thank you so much for being here today, Rachel.
Oh, again, thank you so much for having me, Amy. It was a real pleasure. I knew this would be a fun conversation.
Yes. And to all of our listeners, I'm truly grateful for all of you. Thank you so much for tuning in, and stay tuned for the next episode